Mikko, it's a delight to have you join us here on Bloomberg TV India. Thank you so much for your time.
Thanks for having me.
I think you've been very fortunate. You've been able to survey the landscape, the security landscape over the last 25, 26 years. And you carry with you some fantastic insights and, more importantly, experiences for us to understand how this is likely to go ahead in the future. Now, we know that the security landscape today has a lot of challenges, a lot of perils. But how have you seen it changed over the last 25 years? It wasn't so bad till about 2000, was it?
Well, we thought it was bad, then we realized it actually wasn't. The situation has been changing so drastically. In the early days, we were fighting simple malware spreading on floppy disks written by kids for fun. Today, we're fighting nation-state-sponsored malware doing espionage in foreign states. We're fighting criminal gangs making millions with their malware. And then we have the hacktivist movement using their attacks for protesting.
Mm-hmm. But when we're looking at how the landscape has changed, even the threats and the targets have changed. It's no more just having to show off with your group of BBS friends saying that, hey, I wrote a great piece of code that's just going to bring down a computer. How has that peril itself changed? How have the armaments changed out here?
There's been big changes in technology, because in the early days, these attacks had nothing to do with the internet. We saw malware way before internet became common in anywhere in the world. Mm-hmm. Nowadays, through the internet, of course, everything we see today is either spreading over the internet or stealing data and sending it out over the internet. So these threats have become totally global. This is one of the few kinds of crime which really and truly is global. You might have a criminal and a victim in completely different parts of the world. Geography doesn't matter as well. There's no borders. There's no nothing. And if you think about real-world crime, well, it's different in different parts of the world. There might be dangerous cities or safe cities, but in the online world, there really isn't a difference. If you're worried about online crime, you have to be worried about it everywhere in the world.
You know, a couple of days back, I think the New York Times and Twitter had an attack from Syria, and they used a very interesting word, asymmetric warfare. Now, and used the word, global problem, global terror. Now, geographically, are you able to pinpoint and say that the threats are largely, emanating from this part of the world, or they're directed to this part of the world?
The attacks are coming from different parts of the world, especially when you look at different kinds of attacks.
Okay.
So, for example, for criminal activity using banking Trojans or ransom Trojans or keyloggers, most of these, in our view, are coming from, for example, the ex-Soviet Union.
Right.
So Russia, Ukraine, Belarus, Lithuania, Latvia. Also lots of activity in Europe coming from Romania, for example. Right. And then we have Chinese attackers and South America, especially Brazil.
South America?
Especially there. And
okay.
It's interesting how many of these countries are sort of developing areas. So there's lots of people with skills and internet access, but they might have hard time getting jobs with their skills. And it might be tempting to start making money with online crime instead. And this is one thing that worries me, because right now, Africa is getting online. And there's lots of skilled people in Africa without internet connection, which they will be getting now. So we'll see just how it plays out. Hopefully there won't be bigger problems coming from Africa because of that.
Who are the targets?
The targets of criminal attacks are everybody. Okay. The attackers typically don't really care who they hit. For example, when they're using keyloggers to steal credit card numbers. It doesn't really matter if the credit card owner is in Delhi or in London or in New York. As long as they get the credit cards, they're good. Then we have more targeted criminal attacks, where they're trying to just break into some company to steal confidential information, which they need to sell it to someone else. But the most targeted attacks are then governmental attacks, which have more to do with global espionage than money making.
When you say targeted attacks, I'd like to spend some time talking about targeted attacks. And if I were to think like a criminal, it makes sense to look at a corporation and work, use all my resources against a corporation, because the kind of data that's likely to reside there, apart from financial data, we are looking at intellectual property. What are the most critical of these threats that are affecting corporations?
One thing that we see clearly as a corporate problem right now are banking Trojans targeting corporate banking accounts. So banking Trojans steal money from the banks, but they don't actually target the banks themselves, they target the bank's customers.
Right. Okay.
So when you're doing online payments from your home, you're sending money around. If your computer is infected, it's sending the money to wrong accounts, to the criminals' accounts. But we end users don't have very much money in our accounts. Companies do. So we are clearly seeing online criminals and banking Trojan gangs targeting corporate accounts. And one thing that I nowadays typically do when I'm visiting our customers is that I ask them to take me around and introduce me to their financial department. And then I go and speak with their people and ask, okay, who's in charge of moving money? Who's paying the payments of the company? And there's typically the middle-aged lady or a couple of them handling the accounts. And then I ask them, could you show me your computer, the computer that you use to move all this money around? And they show this desktop on their desk running Windows XP or Windows 7. And I ask how much money they move through it every day. It could be large sums, right? Then I ask them, all right, could you now show me the computer that you use to go to YouTube and go to Facebook and surf the web? Okay. And they're typically confused. They're like, well, and then they show the same computer. And when you think about it, that actually makes no sense. If you're using a computer to move hundreds of thousands of euros or millions of dollars around, why would you use the same computer to surf the web and click on random links? Computers are cheap. You could easily afford to have a separate computer just for moving money around.
Look, when we're looking at attacks on corporations, money is one loss, but more importantly, it's also the question of time that you will need to come back on your feet. Are corporations agile enough in responding to these kind of attacks?
Enterprise level companies typically take this very seriously, and they have professional teams and they run drills and try to make sure that they can avoid attacks or recover from attacks as quickly as possible. But the smaller the companies become, the less this is of concern, and especially small and medium-sized companies are in a very bad position. They have no skills. They don't really think about the problems created by online attacks, and when they get hit, it takes them a very long time to recover.
What's the way forward for them?
Well, one thing that small and medium-sized companies can do, if they don't have their own expertise, is to outsource it. And outsourcing security is always a touchy subject because because you're giving access to your most valuable data to an outside company. But if you don't have the in-house intelligence or in-house expertise to do it, you are better outsourcing it. And you could think about the same thing about real-world guarding. Very few companies have their own people guarding the warehouse in the middle of the night. They outsource it to a guarding company. This is no different. You're outsourcing your computer security to an expert.
I know this isn't on the agenda, but I'm fascinated. I'd like to talk to you about this. Social engineering. How do you guard yourself against that? You just need one smart guy to know when you were born or what your first dog's name was to find out what your access credentials are.
Social engineering works very well. The weakest point in many of these attacks are the people themselves. So you can get so much information by just talking to people and playing to people and trying to deduct more information about them. And today, when you can find so many details about people from the web, from Facebook, from LinkedIn, you can easily use that information to build credentials for yourself. So you can fool people into working for you. And the only way to really fight social engineering is to train the people and make them aware that this is happening. And simple stuff like that, if somebody calls you, pretends to be someone and starts asking questions, just stop it and say, hold, I'll call you back. And then call back to the switchboard of the company they were claiming to be. And if they weren't, then you won't reach them.
I'd like to talk about mobiles for a moment. And while we talk about the smartphone explosion, there's still a lot of dumb phones out there. So are we exaggerating the complexity of this problem? Because there are more dumb phones than smartphones, but is malware still a big problem on the smartphones?
The size of the malware problem on phones is still a fraction of the problem on computers. Most of the problems are still on computers, but it's clearly a growing problem.
Okay.
Most of the new mobile malware is targeting the Google Android system, which is a Linux-based operating system. When you look at the other options, your phone is either running, you could be running a BlackBerry, you could be running an Android, you could be running iOS, you could be running Windows Phone, or one of the older feature phone systems. Of these, the only big problem is on Android-based devices.
Okay.
And that is very surprising because it is a Linux-based system, and Linux-based systems traditionally on computer side have been very secure. But it's also surprising that Windows on computers, which is the number one target there, Windows Phone, isn't hit by any malware. There's no malware for Windows Phone at the moment at all. So it's quite surprising.
It could also be argued that Windows took a lot of its learnings from its 95, 98, 2000 days, and you've been witnessing what's been happening over the last 25 years. Are you able to draw parallels between what is happening in the mobile space right now with respect to security and threats to what happened in the early 90s and late 90s with the PC world?
Microsoft took a lot of criticism for Windows XP around 10 years ago. Windows XP, which for
2001, yeah.
For years and years, it was the most common platform in the world. It's still the second most common operating system today. Yes, XP wasn't very secure at all. However, it was a massive commercial success. They sold so much of the operating system despite of the shortcomings. And it's sort of similar today with Android. Android, when compared to iOS or Windows Phone, is clearly more being targeted by malware. It clearly isn't as secure as the competitors. However, it's massive commercial success. Once again, it is the #1 smartphone operating system on the planet already. So why would they have to change anything? Even though there are security vulnerabilities, it seems to be a success story.
So what are you doing how are you approaching this problem from F-Secure's side? How are you viewing on securing people on the malware front?
We strongly believe that you have no hope in trying to defend your organization against the attacks if you don't understand who's attacking you.
Okay.
So you have to model the enemy. You have to understand who are you, what's your organization, what kind of an enemy would be interested in you. For example, people are worried about Stuxnet. Stuxnet is not going to hit your organization.
It's going to hit a nuclear reactor.
It's going to hit somebody in Iran, maybe. If you're not working for the Iranian nuclear research facilities, you don't have to worry about Stuxnet. Yet people do. So model your systems around the most likely attacker. Understand where are your weak points. And companies like F-Secure then provide specific solution for specific problems. But you have to understand what problem you're trying to solve.
But what about the common man? Is he as worried as you'd like him to be?
The common man probably doesn't know much about security at all. They just use blindly the systems that they find and that are recommended to them. And I always try to keep it very simple when explaining to everyday people about what to do. Step #1, make sure you have a backup. Make sure you have a backup of not just your computer, but your phone, your tablet. Make sure you have a backup so that even if your house burns down, you have the data somewhere. Because our lives are today on our computers, on our phones. We have our photo histories there. If you don't have copies of those, they can and they will disappear. So it really starts from basic stuff like backing up, patching your systems, keeping them up to date, and then and only then buying actual security solutions.
We were talking about malware on Android, and you have iOS, you have BlackBerry BB10, you have Windows, and the number of OSs are growing. You have Firefox coming with its own OS as well. Is this problem likely to be more compounded in the future, or do you see future OS manufacturers ensuring that security is core and integral to the system and not an afterthought?
We are clearly improving. You compare today's operating systems to where we were 5 years ago or 10 years ago, there's a massive shift. Even these new systems like Android, which do have problems, the architecture internally is way ahead of what we used to have just a couple of years ago. So we are improving at all fronts. It's likely that the mobile play will not end up with multiple different operating systems. There probably will be 2 or 3 big operating systems left, just like what we have on our computer side.
Yeah.
So we'll probably see Android being the contender for the #1 spot for years to come.
How complex is the malware problem with applications? In a brief general survey, how many apps out there are infected and how many must I keep away from?
The most common way of getting infected on your computer is browsing the web.
Right.
You click on a link, there's an exploit, and you get infected through a vulnerability.
Yeah.
That's not the way it works on your phones. On your phones, you don't get infected by browsing the web. You get infected by downloading and installing apps.
Right.
So the app you download looks great, works great, but it's Trojanized. So it might be something Angry Birds or something like that, which it looks like Angry Birds, but it's not the original Angry Birds. It's been Trojanized and, for example, might be dialing out to expensive numbers as you play the game. So you really have to be careful where you download free applications from and double check that it's the original from the original author when you install it.
Let's move away from individuals and corporations. Let's talk about governments. What's the nature of problem? I mean, how complex is the threat on that front out? Now, we hear about Syrian attacks coming about. We hear attacks from China or alleged attacks from China. Give me an overview of the landscape out there.
Governments have entered the cyber arena at full force. We are seeing multiple different parties inside governments using cyber attacks and using malware. For example, police in multiple different countries around the world. Police are using now malware against their own citizens to do investigations. Then we have militaries building up cyber capability for any future crises, offensive capability of being able to attack their enemies. But the most active parts inside governments are the intelligence agencies. Intelligence agencies using cyber surveillance and malware and backdoors to gain access to information they're looking for.
When we're talking about, again, attacks, currency, financial attacks, attacks to deprive you of your money are perhaps the most common attacks. And we hear about virtual currencies like Bitcoin. How viable are they? And how easily can this be made more popular?
I'm a strong believer in cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin. I strongly believe they will be a success story in the long run, even in the short run. Maybe not Bitcoin, but maybe one of its competitors. And there's plenty of similar systems out already. Mm-hmm. The idea is great. The capability of moving money instantaneously around the world with no costs, as easily as emailing somebody, you could send money. This is very powerful, also for individuals, but even more for corporations. So I strongly believe Bitcoin will be the future, or a cryptocurrency will be the future. But it's also clear that criminals love virtual currencies like this.
Talking about, criminals and intercepting data, let's move to something completely different, something that's been in the news of late, which is not an organization that's out to deprive you of your money, but an organization that's just keeping an eye on you, even though you might have no reason to be looked down on. Government surveillance. How has this problem grown over the last few years, and where do you see this problem going?
Governments have been doing signals intelligence for decades. Traditionally, this was just listening to radio traffic between, for example, foreign military bases, stuff like that. Today, it is the internet. And internet traffic is more and more encrypted, which means it's hard to intercept from trunk cables or by intercepting cables at the bottoms of the seas. So intelligence agencies are nowadays putting lots of effort into gaining access to information either at the endpoint, at the end user's computer or at the service provider computer. Right. And this is what, for example, the PRISM revelations are all about. Gaining access to information not at the encrypted information as it's traveling between different continents, right, but at the service provider level where it's decrypted and can be easily accessed by surveillance agencies.
How can individuals or common people protect themselves from oversight like this?
It's actually hard for an end user to try to defend against this. You can use encryption, but for example, if you're using services like Gmail, which are encrypted services, it's decrypted at Google's end. Right. And if the foreign government has access to Google servers, like the PRISM revelations claim, it doesn't really matter that it was encrypted in transit. So you really, first of all, should try to avoid foreign services altogether. Okay. And that's very easy to say, but very hard to do in practice. Like, how do you avoid American services? How do you avoid Google, Facebook, Twitter? How do you avoid using Dropbox or Windows or any of the US-based browsers? It's actually impossible. And this is the main problem with the US surveillance on the rest of the world. They have legal right to monitor foreigners when they are using American services, which doesn't sound too bad until you realize that 96% of the planet are foreigners for them.
But this sounds a bit worrying. So is privacy a lost cause?
Internet and the mobile phones are probably the biggest invention of our generation. And now it's turned out that both of these are actually perfect tools for surveillance states. They're the excellent tool to monitor us, monitor where we are, what we do, who do we correspond with. And that's actually sort of sad. We didn't really see this coming. We didn't really build the internet to be used for this, but that's what it's being used for.
Let's talk about hacktivism for a moment. How has this matured over the last 2 decades?
One of my jobs inside F-Secure is monitoring the future threat scenario or the future threat landscape, try to see where future attacks are coming from. So we try to forecast maybe 2 or 3 years into the future. And the rise of hacktivism is an example of something that we totally missed. We didn't see it coming at all. It took us by surprise. We were certainly aware of movements like Anonymous already 5-6 years ago, but it would have been very hard for us to forecast that they became one of the main sources of attacks in such a short time. And today, hacktivist groups like Anonymous are one of the main 3 sources of online attacks.
And is there, how do you protect yourself again?
Movements like Anonymous are not trying to make money for themselves or trying to benefit directly themselves. They're trying to send a message. They're trying to protest. They're trying to use it for political gain.
And propaganda purposes as well.
And propaganda as well. And this means they select their targets. They don't just randomly attack anyone. They pick a target. For example, Bank of America was a target because they shut down all the money transfers to WikiLeaks.
Yeah.
So in most cases, organizations which become a target for an hacktivist group probably could have told it beforehand that, if we do this and that will make hacktivists angry and then they will attack us. And of course, that doesn't mean that you shouldn't do things, but at least you should be aware of what's going to happen when you do things that will make a group of international hackers angry at you.
Coming back and rolling back into our primary discussion of security, are the OS manufacturers doing enough from their end? Are they doing enough, or are they doing as much as you'd like them to do to ensure that security has been, is an integral part of the entire infrastructure, so that you have lesser reasons to worry about where the threats are going to come and whether people are truly being targeted?
People blame operating system manufacturers like Microsoft over and over again for all these problems. And frankly, that's a little bit unfair. Microsoft has really turned around over the last years. They used to be really bad security-wise. Nowadays, they're like the model citizen. And frankly, when you get infected today with your Windows system, in most cases, it's not Microsoft's code which had the problem. You surf the web, you run into an exploit kit which takes over your computer through the web, but it's not Microsoft's code which gets exploited. It's Java inside your browser, or it's Flash, or Adobe PDF Reader, or QuickTime, and all of these are coming from someone else than Microsoft. So operating systems are getting better, but we now have new areas to worry about to make the whole complete picture safer.
What keeps you awake at night?
There's lots of things that keep me up at night, but I think I'm mostly worried about embedded systems security, factories, chemical plants, power plants. Because the fact is that the whole society around us is now being controlled by computers, and they're all hackable computers, hackable one way or another.
So the Hollywood scenario of a young boy sitting in a far-off land with an internet connection trying to shut down the power grid, it's not just a piece of fiction.
Well, it's probably not going to be one kid in a basement, but these systems are accessible and they are hackable, if not by an angry teenager, by an aggressive foreign state. Definitely, that is doable.
Finally, Mikko, who holds the onus of educating people about these problems? Is it with organizations like yourselves, or do OS manufacturers have to take that responsibility, or is it the responsibility of somebody like the government?
Regarding education, there's an initiative in multiple countries now around the world where there's data security days being organized together with the government, together with the local service providers, and then players like Microsoft and security companies. And there's been great results from these. Like just raising the awareness of the everyday user about what this really means. And not trying to make everybody an expert, but explain what it means. How do you take backups? How do you patch your system? How do you get infected? How do you use mobile phones securely? Basic stuff which really today should be taught to everybody.
Thank you so much for your time, Mikko. Fantastic talking to you. And it's fantastic understanding how over the last 25 years that the landscape has changed completely inside out. And hopefully we'll be better secured for the next decade as it rolls. Thank you.